Greetings. We're gonna get started. I'm Ed Steinfeld. I'm the director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you, although he needs no introduction for many of you, but to introduce to you and welcome to the Watson Institute, Domingo Morel. Domingo is assistant professor of political science at Rutgers University, but he will soon be moving to NYU's Wagner School of Public Service. Professor Morel will be speaking on developing scholars, race politics, and the pursuit of higher education, which is the title of his forthcoming book from Oxford University Press. Domingo is the author of Takeover, Race, Education, and American Democracy, which is also from Oxford in 2018, and that book won the W.E.B. Du Bois Distinguished Book Award. Domingo is also the co-editor with Marion Orr, who's also here in the audience today, of Latino Mayors, Power and Political Change in the Post-Industrial City, which was from Temple University Press, also in 2018. Domingo received his PhD in political science from Brown in 2014, and his MA from Rhode Island College, and his BS from the University of Rhode Island. We have a great audience in person today, and we also have an online audience. So Domingo will speak, and then we'll have time for questions. But with that, let me turn it over to you, Domingo Morel. Welcome.
Thank you. So thank you for coming. It's so nice to see so many all friends, all friends. In this presentation, which is my forthcoming book, Developing Scholars, Race Politics, and the Pursuit of Higher Education. So I want to start off with Providence Journal, front page article from May 17th, 1998. The article, Cruel Fate Was No Match for a Determined URI Student. It's an article about Matthew Buchanan, who you see on the right. Matthew Buchanan, when he was 10 years old, was sleeping on the top bunk in his room in the Roger Williams housing projects here in Providence, and he was shot. His father, this was in the middle of the crack era. His father got into an argument with a group of men outside of the building. They left and came back, and then they started shooting into the building, and Matt was shot in the stomach. He survived, and then right before his senior year in high school, his cousin, which is like a brother to him, Douglas Buchanan, he was shot at a party and killed. And so this article was about how Matthew Buchanan overcame all of these life experiences to attend and graduate from the University of Rhode Island. So that's what this article is about. But what the article did not mention was that Matthew Buchanan was able to attend and graduate from the University of Rhode Island because of a special program called Talent Development. The Talent Development Program recruited Matthew out of Central High School, provided the academic support for him to be able to graduate from school, academic and financial support. And so the Talent Development Program, this type of program, was created in 1968. And throughout this time, there were 14 other states that created similar programs throughout the country, right? And so my research is about why did states create special college access program for students of color in the 1960s? Since there is debate among scholars about the role of urban uprisings in the creation of college access opportunities, did the urban rebellions of the 1960s play a role in the creation of these programs? And if so, how? Moreover, since these programs were designed specifically for students of color, how are they part of the broader history of affirmative action policy in the US? Additionally, since many of the initiatives that led to greater college access for historically excluded groups in the 1960s, including affirmative action, student financial aid, and state support for higher education, have been significantly diminished, what political factors help explain the survival of a college access program for students of color? In other words, how did Talent Development Program, quote unquote, beat the odds? Because many programs like Talent Development, within 5 to 8 to 10 years after their creation, started to disappear, right? And so how did talent development beat the odds? In order to understand that, to answer these questions, to try to understand, provide context for what happened with talent development and similar programs, we first have to understand the history of college access in the United States. So from the early 1900s to the mid 1900s, college access was essentially minimal in the United States, right? And it wasn't after World War II where we start to see expansion of opportunities. And so as you see here, between 1940 to 1960, it went from roughly 1.5 million to 3.5 million people attending college, right? So this was the largest expansion of college access opportunities in the history of the United States up to that point. But of course, as other scholars have noted, the expansion of opportunities at this period in time was excluded many people, including women and students of color. So it took the 1960s for opportunities to be expanded to other communities, other marginalized people. And so throughout the 1960s, we see these federal programs expand, right? So the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 created the Federal Work Study Program and the Upward Bound Program. The Higher Education Act of 1965 created what eventually becomes the Pell Grant, the Talent Search Program, Student Support Services. And the Talent Search and Student Support Services joined together with Upward Bound to create the Federal TRIO Program. So this helps insert the federal government in policymaking to expand college access to those who were previously excluded. But there were many limits, right? Although the federal college access initiatives provided more financial aid and college preparatory programs for underserved populations, traditional college admissions processes remained unchanged. And what this meant was that other than the 2-year colleges, which generally had open admissions, students still had to meet college admissions requirements to get into these institutions. And oftentimes it meant having SAT scores that for students of color, students where English is not their first language, made it, excluded them from having access, right? And so in order to get around this problem, well, you know, what was created? It was affirmative action. Right? So affirmative action became a policy to try to create opportunities for students who, I hear an echo, sorry about that. Oh, sorry. It became a policy to provide access to students who are high achieving students, have done well throughout high school, but mostly SAT scores prevented them from accessing institutions of higher education. And the elite institutions of higher education particularly instituted these types of programs of affirmative action. But even though there was this type of affirmative action, there were community activists throughout the country who didn't think that went far enough. And they advocated for what I call a community-centered affirmative action policy. So what they were saying is, in order to really provide access to people, to historically marginalized populations, the opportunity to go to college, the college admissions process altogether needs to be eliminated, right? They had a more radical vision of college access, of affirmative action, saying that these policies, these structures are excluding students of color, particularly Black students, and even with affirmative action, the traditional, more conventional affirmative action, is still not going to do what it needs to do to provide college access. So they advocated for a more radical vision of affirmative action. And it's that radical vision that some argue was part of a speech Lyndon Johnson gave, what's called the To Fulfill These Rights speech back in 1965 at Howard University. Johnson, in acknowledging persisting struggles for Black Americans in various areas, including jobs, housing, and healthcare, vowed that his administration was committed to help the American Negro fulfill the rights which, after a long time of injustice, he is finally about to secure. So Lyndon Johnson gives the speech at Howard University in 1965, pushes for a more radical vision of essentially affirmative action for Black people, and something happens, right? And it's never fulfilled, according to some scholars. And Katznelson, political scientist, argued that although Johnson embraced a radical program of attempting to close existing gaps between white and Black Americans in housing, employment, healthcare, and education, he notes that this vision was undermined by a series of events in the mid-1960s, including the escalating Vietnam War, tensions within the Democratic Party, the resurgence of the Republican Party, and racial violence in American cities, right? That the riots that were happening in American cities derailed this vision of a more radical vision of addressing inequities in the United States. And in fact, that's supported by existing scholarship, right? So Omar Wassau, for instance, had published an article where he finds that violent protests led white Americans to shift their support for the Republican Party, which led to the election of Republican candidate for the presidency, Richard Nixon, in 1968. Sears and McConaughey and Gillens also find that the uprisings contributed to decreasing support for race-based policy among whites. So there's a body of literature that says that these, what they call riots, others call uprisings or rebellions, that they actually were counterproductive, that they harmed the goals of those who were engaged in these types of protests. But what I argue in this research is that by focusing attention to politics at the local and state level, we see a different effect of the rebellions and find that the uprisings helped advance and in some cases set in motion a series of political dynamics that were not visible from an analysis at the through national politics. And that the community-centered approach to college access that activists and programs they help create provide an alternative, more radical vision of affirmative action that has received less attention from scholars. Right? So that there is, that these rebellions, if we look beyond the national level, so look at the subnational level, that there are things that were happening there that the scholarship is not really picking up on. And so I engaged several scholarships, including social movement scholarship, right? And as I was mentioning earlier about this question about how did the talent development program beat the odds? Well, part of the reason here, right, we know that, like I mentioned, 5, 6, 7 years after the program was created, there were cuts to these programs. Well, that's consistent with the literature. The literature is pretty clear. Like when these programs were established, social movements helped create these programs, then they start to disappear because the social movements start to disappear, right? And the politics that created these programs are no longer sustaining these types of programs, right? So the literature is pretty clear on this. Ibram Kendi, who researched Black student mobilization on college campuses, argues that many of the concessions on the part of universities served the purpose of politicizing the movement. In policing and incarceration, for instance, political scientist Bachelor Weaver and historian Elizabeth Hinton document the shift from the war on poverty to the war on crime as wholly intertwined with the 1960s rebellions as an effort for conservative politicians to curry the favor of local officials and white liberals. And then, the classic work by Piven and Cloward, who argued that the key to an understanding of relief giving is the functions it serves for the larger economic and political order. They add, historical evidence suggests that relief arrangements are initiated or expanded during the occasional outbreaks of civil order produced by mass unemployment and are then abolished or contracted when the political stability is restored. Right? So that the uprisings created the conditions to create these types of programs, but when that threat is no longer there, then the need for these programs are no longer there. So that's what the scholarship shows, right? And indeed, we have evidence, like I mentioned, that this is indeed what happened. But while the literature helps explain the end or declining state support for special college access programs in the 1970s and beyond, it does not explain why some programs have survived, and in some cases grown despite the constant threats. And I argue that part of the reason why is because these programs never stopped being social movements, right? That they continue to use protest or the threat of protest as an essential component of their movement. So while, the scholarship is consistent with social movements dying down and the programs that are no longer existing, I'm arguing that in the case of these programs, they never stopped being a social movement and that the element of protest continued to be an important part of these programs, right? And so in doing that, this work contributes to the policy maintenance scholarship, right? Because for the most part, this scholarship is dominated by a perspective from the national level, right? So people who study, Congress and the presidency, for instance, they examine these institutions to then establish build the scholarship on how policies are entrenched. What I'm arguing is that by looking at the community level, looking at the subnational level and what communities are doing and using protests to make sure policies are maintained, that this is something new. This is something that the scholarship's currently not talking about. So, in addition to this, right, so that's essentially the first part of the book, right? The second part of the book examines this other question. And that is what I call this reproduction of restricting reproducing restriction. I'm sorry. That is that while programs have been successful, that there are these other elements of restriction that emerge, right? And so that we need to pay attention to these often hidden forms of restriction, which I'll talk about in a second or later. But before I do that, there's a disclosure. Now, this is not a disclosure to most people in this room because you all know me for the most part. This is me, a young me with Matthew Buchanan. So Matthew Buchanan, he was supposed to be here, actually. He couldn't be here because he's a principal at Somerville High School in Massachusetts. And so he had an event that he couldn't come. But Matthew is a good friend of mine. I mean, he's like my brother, right? We graduated from Central High School. So we were there together when Frank Folio came and recruited students to the Talent Development Program. So I am a product of the program. And then I worked for the program, right? And so need to disclose that. At the same time, want to make it very clear that because of my affiliation with the program and, I, as a student and as somebody who worked for the program, that I am aware that there will be critiques about bias, right? That my proximity to the program means that my research might not be sound. And this project is a rejection of that premise, saying that just because I am a product of the program does not mean that I can't engage in the scholarly enterprise, right? And so if you're going to critique the questions, critique the methods, which I'll talk about in a second, but I reject the idea that because I'm a product of the program that I can't be a researcher and study the program, right? And so speaking of methods, so I rely on an in-depth case study of the Talent Development Program at the University of Rhode Island. I interviewed over 50 individuals, including former and current program directors, program staff, students, officials from the Rhode Island Office of Higher Education, University of Rhode Island officials, admissions, enrollment management, academic advisement, and so forth. I interviewed community leaders who were involved in the creation of the program. And for archival data, I relied on several sources, including the Talent Development Program, University of Rhode Island Library, Rhode Island Secretary of State Archives, Rhode Island Board of Trustees and of state colleges, and several newspaper sources, primarily the Providence Journal. And then I create an original data set, which I'll talk about later on. So that's what I use in terms of data. So creating TD Nation. So how do we get here? Right. So in order to understand how TD or TD Nation is created, first have to go back to the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. Right? The Black community here in Providence have been fighting for many, many years to create college access opportunities to students, Black students from Providence to the colleges, right? And their push, their advocacy eventually led to the creation of several committees or commissions. In 1963, the city of Providence created the Providence Human Relations Commission. In 1963 as well, Governor John Chafee formed a task force on civil rights to study the grievances of minority groups. In 1965, the Rhode Island General Assembly created a special commission to study the entire field of education. And so after two states reports and growing concern in the state Black community, by the end of 1967, very little had been done. Very little. And in fact, at the beginning of 1968, the three institutions of higher education of Rhode Island, University of Rhode Island College, and Community College, at the time was called Rhode Island Junior College, had combined enrollment of 11,600 students. And all total, there were 65 Black students at these three state institutions. 65, right? By the beginning of 1968. But the violent protests begin to change this, right? So in 1966, between 1966 and 1968, we have hundreds of protests across the country. In 1967 alone, up to that time, the deadliest urban uprising in the history of the United States. Of course, people know about the Newark Rebellion in 67, and then just a couple of weeks after that in Detroit. But right here in Providence, the same thing was happening. It receives less attention, right, because it's a smaller city, but the same thing was happening. So in August of 1966, police and Black residents in the south side of Providence clashed, which led to the arrest of 40 people. And this was, not too far from here, around Rhode Island Hospital, right? And the next year, July 31, nearly the same time period, roughly 200 people were involved in civil unrest on the south side of Providence. And over a 2-day period, dozens were arrested, injured, including 6 police officers. So what's happening across cities is also happening here in Providence, right? And then the Kerner Commission report comes out, right? So in March of '68, community leaders who were frustrated joined other allies, folks from the University of Rhode Island, and they attend a board meeting of the Board of Trustees, and they hand out the Kerner Commission report. And the Kerner Commission report, which was a study of the uprisings the year before and the conditions that led to the uprising, and make recommendations for what needs to be done, right? They come to this meeting and say, if we don't do something, the same things are going to happen, continue to happen here. And we need to do something in the state of Rhode Island to provide college access and other opportunities to Black students, right? But they were talking specifically about creating college access to Black students from the city of Providence. Otherwise, we're going to continue to see these kinds of things escalate, right? So this is in March '68. In April of '68, the Providence Journal publishes an article talking about the threat of uprisings in Massachusetts and what concern essentially that, raising concerns about what might be happening in Providence. And as you all know, April 4th, Dr. King is assassinated. On April 9th, the Board of Trustees of state colleges met and approved plans to correct its own admitted failure to give significant help to Negro students. During that board meeting, the board chair, Lila Sampson-Lee, stated that following King's assassination, she realized that despite a lot of talk, the board had done nothing significant for Negro students in Rhode Island. And so the board at that meeting approved the measure to increase the number of Black students at 3 institutions of higher education, which included a special program for disadvantaged youth. That was the birth of what eventually becomes the Talent Development Program. At the time, it was the program for disadvantaged youth, right? So they didn't know where to get these students from. So they relied on community activists, particularly a community activist not too far from here, Charlie Ford, who was from the Fox Point neighborhood. They went to barbershops and went to different community organizations to recruit students. They went to high schools. They had coaches recruit students. And they brought in, it's not clear whether it was 50 students or 43 students. So I have contradicting information on this, to the campus of the University of Rhode Island in the summer of 1968. The students were told that if they completed that summer program, they will be entering one of the 3 state institutions, University of Rhode Island College, or the junior college. However, what was also understood was that if they did well throughout the summer program, that they would be attending the University of Rhode Island, right? That's what the students understood. By the end of the 6 weeks that summer of the summer program, students thought, those who had made it to the end and had done everything that they needed to do, they thought that they were going to attend the University of Rhode Island. But Charlie Ford and others were notified by the administrators that the university had no intention of accepting these students. No intention. And when the community activists found out that this was happening, they called the university and said, "We will set this university on fire if you do not accept these students." And ultimately, after negotiations and all of that, the university decided they're going to accept 13 students. However, when the students were notified that this was happening, they all came into a room. They all thought they were going to get accepted to the University of Rhode Island. And at that meeting, they learned that only 13 were going to get accepted. And obviously, most of them were heartbroken. And to this day, when I was interviewing people, including Frank Santos, who eventually became an admissions officer at the University of Rhode Island, he thought that he never got accepted because something was lacking in his college application. And the reality was, and I still haven't shared this with Frank Santos, so I will share it with him when the book comes out, or whenever, that it was nothing that he did. Nothing that none of them did. The university had no intention on accepting them, right? And so from the beginning, the existence of this program, there has been a struggle to not only create it, but to keep it alive, right? And so that the threat, eventually they respond to this threat and accept 13 students. That threat never went anywhere. By 1971, when the program was actually growing, So students every year after 1968, the program was growing. The university then threatened the program again. And the students mobilized, right? So we'll skip this. 1971, the students mobilized and they took over the administration building, right? So this is in 1971. So I think it's important to note, in addition to this, that this was not only happening at the University of Rhode Island, it's happening on campuses across the country, where these types, we call retrenchment, the policies are getting reversed, is happening across the country. And so at this critical juncture, students stepped up and said, you're not going to cut this program. You're not going to cut off access. And in fact, you're going to grow the program. And that's what wound up happening. The president, who was dismissing them throughout this whole period of time, because it was essentially over a year of protesting that eventually culminated with this moment here. The president was dismissing these students. He finally, they forced him to the table and said, among all the list of things that this university will cut, the last thing that this university will cut is the talent development program, which it was because direct response to these students, saying that if there was anything to be cut, everything else will be cut before this program is cut. So this is in 1971. 1992, similar type of climate at the University of Rhode Island, where students felt not welcomed, felt in some ways also attacked. You get the Black Student Leadership Group taking over Taft Hall. Earl Smith, who you see here, rest in peace. He passed away maybe a month ago. Was one of those leaders. Here they brought President Carruthers to the table and demanded that the needs of the Black students on campus be met, including the continued support for the talent development program. 1998, students organized a protest. This was the Black Student Leadership, Brothers United for Action organized a protest. This is very fuzzy, but what you see here is a long line of people walking from the library protesting. I believe Lillian Abreu. Carol, were you also part of this protest? Yeah. So Carol was, yes. So Carol was part of this group. Lillian Abreu was part of this group. So, what I argue here is that these protests helped maintain the program. And so through this case study of the Talent Development Program shows how violent protest was essential to the founding of the program, and how continued protests and threats of continued protests have been an important element in the maintenance of programs, right? So this is a contribution to the way that we understand from a political science perspective how policies are maintained. And here we see how the program has grown over time, right? So between 1968 to 2008, we see, particularly after the 1980s, we see continued growth. And here, I know it's not that visible for everyone. Here, what we have is talent development funding for students. So part of the experience of students who enter the talent development program is that they get financial aid. And so here the red line represents university tuition. The blue line represents the talent development program grant that students receive. And we see that for a period of time, the students were not receiving the same type of funding, but since 2012, that has closed. So the program has continued to grow. And financial aid for these students is now meeting university tuition expenses, right? So here's evidence of the program growing and it's still a success. But there's one aspect of the program that has not, right? And that is, what I call reproducing restriction is when we pay attention to the college majors and what students are graduating with, there's other layers of things that reveal themselves. And so one of the things is, going back to Matthew Buchanan. Matthew Buchanan, I've talked about, is now a principal at Somerville High School. He wanted to be a teacher at the University of Rhode Island, and he could not become a teacher. And that to me, among other things, was also a signal, because part of the people that I interviewed from that first class of talent development, we had multiple teachers. And when I asked these folks that I interviewed from that first class, what kind of barriers, what kind of experience did you have to become a teacher? They would say, yeah, we had racist teachers, but we could just become teachers, right? If we wanted to become a teacher, we just became a teacher. And this is consistent with what we know Black students across time, right? The education profession has been usually accessible to Black students. But something is happening, right? So here we have talent development students who declared business, nursing, education, and engineering, and who graduated between these years, 2005 and 2017, right? So out of all the students who actually, throughout this period of time, who graduated within this period of time as well, who declared business, about 45% or so graduated with business. Nursing, about 35% or so graduated with nursing. Education is about 8%. So that's students who declared that they wanted to be a secondary elementary education teacher, declared that as a major and actually graduate with that degree. It's only about 8%. And then engineering is closer to 50%, right? So this is talent development students. By comparison, we have data for one cohort of University of Rhode Island students who are not talent development students, right? And so we see actually, so that represents the orange. So this is only one cohort. And so these are students, the 2012 cohort who graduated within 6 years, right? So in terms of business, it's about equal. But look at nursing, right? So students who declare nursing, who are not talent development students, they graduate with a nursing degree about 70% of the time. Look at education, about 55% of the time, right? They graduate with education. And then engineering is about equal, right? So in terms of talent development comparison to general student population, business and engineering are actually, and we could have conversation after this. I'm sure the talent development folks have a good explanation for this, right? But nursing and secondary education is alarming. And so what helps explain this? Now, the argument is, and some people will say, well, part of the reason why is students have a major of choice, right? They could decide that they don't want to pursue a particular major. And that's the argument that we often hear. And what I'm trying to argue is it's not that simple, right? It's not just that. And it has to deal with requirements to get into these majors, right? And so we see here, these are requirements between 1968 to 2018. All the way on the left, we have, and these are GPA requirements to enter the majors. The School of Nursing, the School of Business, School of Engineering, and Education. And so what happens is that after the 1968, so in the early 1970s, now students who wanted to become teachers or students who wanted to become nurses or enter one of these other majors, they cannot just enter the major. They had to meet a certain threshold to enter the major. And oftentimes it was a GPA threshold. And so you see nursing, for instance, in 1968, the requirement to enter nursing was a 0. There was none. The same thing for all of these other programs. But by the mid-1970s, they start to increase. As of 2018, the GPA to enter the nursing major was a 3.0. But if you ask people who work at the University of Rhode Island, advisors, you know that at a 3.0, you're not getting into nursing. That's the minimum, but you have to get a 3.5, 3.6, right, to be able to compete. And so this is happening across the board, these secondary admissions processes. And so what I'm arguing is that this is an element of restriction that people are not talking about, that is preventing students like talent development students who come into the university because they do not meet regular admissions requirements, right? That is preventing them from accessing these majors. Now, the question is it just talent development students at the University of Rhode Island? So I tested this, right? So I created a data set of GPA requirements for these 4 majors in every state college at university, 4-year state college university in the country, right? And to answer these questions, I, again, constructed this original data set of these majors. The way that I collected these data sets, so this is 2019 data. I collect data from the National Center of Education Statistics, the U.S. Census, State Higher Education Executive Office Associations, and so forth. And I run several models, and we could talk about that in a second. Here's some descriptive findings. University of Rhode Island is not alone. So this is, the first one here is percent of public colleges or universities with some grade point average requirement to enter business, education, engineering, or nursing. About 91% of these universities across the country have some GPA requirement to get into these 4 majors. About 78% of these universities have a requirement of at least 2.75 in at least one of these 4. And about half have at least one of these 4 majors where students need to have a 3.0 or higher to get in. So this is not unique to the University of Rhode Island. It's happening across the country where universities have adopted GPA requirements for students to get into these majors. And so I run a series of models. And what I want to do is, the first one is I do a cumulative GPA for all of the universities. And the cumulative, what I'm talking about here is I add what the GPA requirements are for those 4 majors. Again, nursing, education, engineering, and education. So I add them up, right? And so in the model, I include special, whether university has a special college access program or not, right? A program like talent development. I have all of these control variables. So what the in-state tuition is, the percent of applicants that are actually admitted to the university, percent Black students, percent Latino students, percent white students, percent women, and so forth, right? These are all control variables here. We could talk about this after the presentation if you have any questions. And what I find is, and so it's important to note too, this data is for 1 year. It's only 2019. So we have to be very careful about making any causal claims. This is not saying that this is causing this, but trying to see if there's any associations here. And the strongest factor is percent of Black students enrolled at the university. And what we mean by that is that as the percent of Black students increase at a university, the GPA requirements also increase. And that is the strongest factor we have, a variable that we have. And so here's the predicted probabilities. If you have 0% Black students at your university, then that cumulative GPA is about 5.0. Cumulative GPA requirements across those 4 majors. By the time you get to 10%, it increases to about 9%, and so forth, right? So I'm sorry, 9%. It increases 1 point for every 10% increase in Black students, right? And so this is the strongest association. Latino students are also strongly associated, significantly associated, but not as much as Black students. So increases in Latino students at the university also increases the likelihood that is associated with the increased likelihood that GPAs will increase as well. And then to the models related to special college access programs. In other words, if a university has a special college access program like talent development, is there any association with increasing GPAs? And I do find evidence of that. So in terms of the combined GPA requirement, if you have a combined GPA across the 4 GPAs, if you have a special college access program, is associated with essentially a 0.7 increase in your GPA and your cumulative GPA requirements. If for business, having a special college access program is also statistically significantly associated, and education is also. For engineering and nursing, there's a positive direction, positive association, is not statistically significant. So what does this mean, right? We need to explore what is happening that is creating these types of restriction, these types of barriers for students to enter these majors. What I argue is that there is this proliferation of credential cartels, what I call credential cartels, and these credential cartels are made up of accrediting organizations, they're made up of private foundations, universities, of course, right? That they are working together to create these types of barriers that are not exposed to any political response from the community. In the 1960s, it was very clear that if the university was not accepting these students, we needed to do something about it, right? And this is what the protests were about, to create college access opportunities. But when it comes to the secondary admissions process to enter the majors, that is not subjected to political intervention, reaction from the community, partly because the community doesn't know. I think most people would say, well, you got accepted to the university, good. And no one ever has a conversation about, well, you couldn't get into nursing. You couldn't get into education, right? And so through the Q&A, we can maybe talk about education. Education has a historical, the education requirements have a history of restriction, history of creating barriers for people of color, particularly Black students, right? And particularly after 1954, after Brown v. Board, right? So again, these findings raise questions about higher education's ability to address inequality, despite the commonly held belief that higher education is a key ingredient in any effort to address inequality. And if higher education is to meet its promise of serving as a vehicle of upward mobility, democratic pressures have to be mobilized against the political structures that restrict opportunities. And so in the book, I create, what I call a political path forward, consisting of 3 parts, right? The first part is commitment to a scholar development logic, right? So like talent development, we need to develop more in these types of programs that are going to take students who are called, quote unquote, not college ready, but with support and financial and academic support will be successful. So that's clearly part of it. But then the other part is politicizing the secondary admissions process and credential cartels. It's not enough to get students to get into the universities. We need to then advocate and put political pressures on these barriers that are often hidden that prevent students of color from entering the profession. And then what I call an economy for the public. And that is, part of the reason why these credential cartels are limiting students from entering these professions is because there is an incentive to limit the access of these individuals, that the workforce, that the economy is not able to withstand the increased number of new people, new entrants, right? So that we need to think about an economy that can withstand, that can absorb these new people entering the universities and these majors. So we need to think about what that means. And so that's all. And so here are some images of some people that, have made this possible. Here is Reverend Harge, which is actually the second director of the program. The second photo is Harold Langlois, who was the first director of the program, along with 2 former students who were actually teachers, right? Donna Jean Wozencroft was one of them. So we have a Wozencroft in the room. Mr. D, or Leo DeMeo, the third director of the program. Frank and Sharon Folio, who are with us here today, who worked for the program for 40 years? Over 40 years. Gerald Williams, who's in the back as well, the current director of the program, and these beautiful students who are current students. So that's all I have for now. Any questions? Yeah. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about your decision to focus on public institutions? Because it occurs to me that another approach of sort of private action would be to just subvert public institutions entirely and look to private foundations and private universities to increase this access.
Yeah, good question. So I focus on the public institutions because public institutions have the mission of serving the public, and what this is, I think, is a more of a problem in the public institutions for this reason. For students who get accepted to Brown University, students who get accepted to Harvard, Yale, they're not subjected to the same types of secondary admissions processes, right? And oftentimes it's because the students that get accepted into these universities already meet high SAT requirements and these kinds of requirements. So for them, those requirements are not the same as for the public universities, right? And so for that reason, that the role that the public university is supposed to serve, and that the emergence of these policies are more likely to be happening in public institutions, that's the reason why I focus on the publics. Yeah.
Great talk.
Thank you.
Your date definitely thought-provoking. And a few questions. And so the establishment of credential cartel, it's basically a mechanism of restricted trade, right? And against African American students. But my son's an engineer, So there's really no difference. Why not in the field engineer? Engineer is very attractive, a career.
Yeah.
And but also not in business. So half of four careers seems to have restricted trade, but why not the other half?
Yeah, good question. So here we don't find, right, that engineering and business. I doubt that we're going to find similar things across the country. And so we have talent development people here that could talk to us a little bit about this. My argument would be that the reason why business and engineering are not the same is because the program and the university have worked to mentor, to provide support systems for these students, right? So jump in, talent development folks, jump in if I'm wrong here. But for instance, engineering, there is a staff member that works for the engineering department that works with talent development to support students in the engineering program. So that's number one. Number two, the threshold to enter the engineering program is the lowest among all of them. It's a 2.0, right? And so while it is difficult to become an engineer and yet rewarding to become an engineer because it pays well and things like that, the structure within the university for talent development students is a lot more welcoming. The threshold is lower, and there are support systems there where it may not exist for these other majors.
Engineering and business is less racist.
I don't want to say that they're. I don't want to say that they're less racist. I think that they have been open to the idea of creating support systems better than these other institutions, right?
The other thing, GPA is great, right? It's great. And so is there any differential, great deflation or great, inflation, right? If we discourage, African going into those professional trade, you can deflate your grade, make it difficult to get high grade, right? Did you see any of those mechanisms working?
I didn't. So I just studied, went into websites and found what their GPAs were and the minimum requirements. So I didn't dig into it in that way.
Grade is subjective, right? It's not much objective.
I mean that's a fair question. Absolutely. And for that, precisely for that reason, it can be used to weaponize, for restriction, right? And so I think I think that's a fair point.
English is an asset. It's not
Yeah.
like multiple choices, right?
Yeah.
So you can introduce bias into
Perhaps.
those kind of
Yeah.
forms very easily.
Yeah. Good.
I'm not insinuating.
No, I got it. You wanted to say something about
Yeah, one of the things that I would just throw into the mix is that when you look at education and nursing, those two professions have credentialing criteria as you move through in order to practice, whether you're a nurse or you're a teacher. And it begins as an undergraduate. And a lot of times the reputation and the success of the programs at an institution are tied to the success of the graduates as they credential their way in. Credentials for business or engineering are often, they're voluntary. You can become a credentialed engineer at different levels, but you don't have to. Once you have your degree, you're able to practice. And I think the same is true of business. And I watched that evolve over the years as these secondary credentials, the cartels, I love that term, you know that. I watched those evolve and trickle back down into the programs where even in nursing at URI, you have to practice for those nursing exams, the board exams, and that's part of your grade, what you score during your second and your third and fourth years. So I think those things are all linked, and it's all, it's part of the whole picture. Isn't it?
So what you're saying is the credentialing of the school programs, it depends on ultimate the graduate's performance. Are those national exams?
It's an important part of that picture. That's what I've seen. That was my experience.
So you say it's a more self-preserving mechanism for school to make it harder.
Wow. Yeah, you could say that, yeah.
Sadly, it's true.
No, I think it's a great presentation and phenomenal thought-provoking kind of breakdown of what you kind of captured. And especially as a student that's coming into the program who's already potentially behind, these secondary hurdles, you know, you don't realize how big the gap really is. Because to get to that place where I can get into that program, if the support's not there, or my maturity's not there, or there's other factors, I just need more time to get there. That excludes me because the timing moves on from freshman to sophomore, and then I just have to pick something else to keep pace.
Exactly. You sound like you've lived it. Exactly. Yeah.
I have another layer, a wrinkle to throw into that. And that's looking at the students who maybe they make it through past the secondary, restrictions, they make it into the program. There's also that social element that's missing in terms of the ultimate success. Because when you limit the number of students who have similar identities to you, and you limit the number who get into the programs, I'm now a soldier of one trying to make it through this program and navigate my way without those social supports that we know as students are really critical to our success, right? You don't fit in, you're always the outlier, you're always the outsider, the one who's othered. And that, I think, also has an impact on how well students make it to the end, you know?
I agree.
I agree with a colleague who mentioned this is a wonderful talk, and you put it together quite well. Policy implications are profound in terms of what you brought up in the end of your discussion. And so, one of the things I want you to think about is the politics around the secondary access component, particularly here in Rhode Island, where, as your data show, it's seemingly the nursing and the education, the majors. Those are two components that are so important to the Rhode Island economy. The healthcare, as I understand what's happening in and around Providence, for example, is what people are talking about the future. So it seems to me, in response, that in terms of political mobilization, you're getting healthcare executives to understand how important this is for the future of the economy of the state and Providence ought to be something you ought to have an open ear to.
Absolutely.
I don't know if you can respond. I don't know. Maybe they tried to, but it seems to me pressure on lifespan and others ought to be part of the political dynamic here to change this.
Yes. So I think political pressure needs to be asserted on places like lifespan, and thinking about how can it be asserted on these accrediting organizations as well, right? Because what these accrediting organizations are incentivized to minimize the people who enter the professions, right? And so I write about in the book that it's not just nursing, it's not just education, the law profession, the medical profession, they all do this, right? So the lawyers are saying, if we have so many lawyers, then that's bad for our bottom dollar, right? We can't charge enough, right? So that's part of it too, is politicizing these accreditations organizations. But in a place like Rhode Island, and across the country where there is a need for nurses now, right? There's a nursing shortage. I don't know that part of the conversation is these secondary admissions processes to get into nursing. I've never seen that conversation. So I agree with you entirely that there needs to be that the project of moving, increasing access for students of color and addressing the shortage of nurses has to involve this conversation, no question. And then education. I mean, so many of us in this room have been involved in the struggle to increase the number of teachers of color in the state of Rhode Island. We are among the worst in the country, right? And what people we do not talk about is something like this, like the data that I show. We have students who want to be teachers. The argument that people don't want to be teachers. No, they want to be teachers. The question is, why aren't they becoming teachers? And when we look at the data and we look at the history of this, it becomes pretty clear. There is a racist intention. There was a racist intention in creating what are the national teachers examinations, which are today called the praxis, right? These examinations and these policies were created to, A, displace Black teachers after Brown v. Board, right? So after desegregation to allow the space for white teachers to enter the black schools. So it was created first for that. It was also created to justify pay inequities, so saying that students who score lower on the exams can be paid less. And we know that these exams were biased, so they provided the justification for black teachers to pay less. And then after the 1970s, when these opportunities expanded for black students to enter colleges, it was used to prevent them from entering the profession, right? And this is the racial legacy of these exams. And Rhode Island is, instead of addressing this, has in the past 15 years or so increased the requirements, praxis requirements to enter the profession, right? And so this has to become part of the political process too.
Where's the political pressure here? Is it at the state legislature level? Who's making these?
So overall, it's at the commissioner's office, right? Commissioner of Education, ultimately, right? But it's not only that. The universities need to, who are preparing these students, political pressure needs to be put on these departments of education. The state legislature needs to hear it as well. An important role, right? Because they are ultimately, do they confirm the commissioner of education, the state legislature? I can't remember. So obviously he's appointed by the governor, the commissioner, right? So I think that they play a critical role. And members of the board of education, both the higher education and K through 12, they're all subjected to some sort of state legislative. So I think that there's these mechanisms there that pressure points, exactly, absolutely, yes.
I love this talk and I'm taking great inspiration from it. And I'm just thinking about the different layers of politics that are intermingled. Is it meaningful to talk about the variations within departments, within schools, their politics? Because if you look at Brown, I mean, one of the things that has happened at Brown is that you can see changes in different units over time, even though there's a common institutional leadership. So when I'm thinking about, in particular, and I'll stop with this point, the different credentialing that's expected. So that's introducing this really marvelous comparison. But are there meaningfully different politics within engineering and business versus nursing and teachers? And in particular, to ask the provocative question, are the teaching faculty, are the nursing faculty more restrictive in their commitment to diversity and equity and inclusion than are the business and engineering faculty?
Without doing the empirical research on this, I don't think that there's much of a difference across all four in terms, my sense. I think all four deal with their own forms of racism. I think education is particularly a problem because the teaching profession was the only profession for many years that was open to Black people. And because it was the only profession, and it meant, and it continues to mean so much to the empowerment of Black communities, it was targeted. I would argue it was targeted as a primary source for these types of policies to emerge to restrict. But because it was the leading profession for African Americans to enter, the middle class, doesn't mean that the others are less racist, right? And so that's why I want to make that distinction. I think it's across the board a problem. It just seems like education is more of a problem because how can I say this? The power economically and politically of what it meant to be a teacher had to be targeted, right? And so in my other book on takeovers of schools, that's what I essentially argue, right? Is that the schools are such an important part of the ecosystem, political and economic, of communities, that then attacking the Black teaching force becomes an important part of a political strategy, right? And so that's what I would say to that. Yes.
Yeah, I sort of understand. You're hinting right? And the educator can control the mind. It's a very powerful position. Can make social change, social political changes, right? You bring what
Absolutely.
you got, yeah.
Absolutely.
And sir, and you bring up a very good point about nursing. And nursing a tremendous potential promising career. It's not just because shortage, in capitalist system, I was demand supply, like. But today, if you spend 2 more years, get a degree, nurse practitioner, you have exactly this privilege as a physician. And in fact, I think nurse practitioner more into the territory, of privileged class.
That concerns me as someone who had to see my primary care physician.
So you're absolutely correct. So that's why education in nursing was the prime target, because it's very powerful.
Thank you.
You gonna get me?
Yeah.
It seems that, based on your other comment, it's impossible to escape the standardized testing, that it just continues to haunt the whole system.
And standardized testing is rooted in racism, right? That's its explicit purpose. Now we can talk about all the nice things and people make arguments for it. At the end of the day, that's what it is. This praxis test, that students need to take in order to enter teaching the major and then graduate to be able to become a teacher, it's rooted in a racist past of exclusion, right? And the same applies to the SATs, right? So, what this?
The high school testing standards.
Yeah, exactly, and so the SATs, it was easy to fight against the SATs, right? In a way, it was easy, right? People saying, well, people of color are not getting into universities as SATs, creating an affirmative action program to get around it. But the community activists are saying that's not enough. This affirmative action of having one student out of Central High School going to Harvard University, that's not the solution, right? The solution is that Rhode Island College, University of Rhode Island, they're the ones that are supposed to provide this the higher education really to the public. They're the ones that need to be targeted, and that's what programs like Talent Development and others did. And so SAT then becomes a clear target for this to get around the questions of the barriers. But for the secondary admissions process, it's not, because people are not talking about it, or we don't know about that. But standardized tests are being just as harmful at the secondary stage as it was at the primary stage.
But GPA is not standard test.
No, but in terms of education, there's a standardized test component that students have to meet. So I collect data and I present data on GPAs, but the book also talks about these other aspects of restriction, which include standardized tests. Yeah.
I was really shocked by the education number. I mean, in light of an article this week that suggested we're doing great in Providence on diversifying the teaching corps.
We are not.
And but you have historical data. I'm wondering, is this a data point that can be monitored and from year to year, so you can say we're still not graduating or admitting enough Black students to these programs to ever get to the goal of our teachers?
Absolutely. And I think this is what requires political pressure, right? We need to be able to say, and particularly, again, with the state institutions. Providence College has their education. Brown has education. But it's really Rhode Island College and University of Rhode Island that are producing the teachers that are going to be teaching in Rhode Island. And if we look at their data, it's awful, right? It's awful. We are not a single institution in Rhode Island is graduating the number of students of color that they should be graduating. And so the data is pretty clear on this. What I think the data is not clear is the conversation about why is this? Because the conversation is dominated by this idea that we have, students of color, whether Latino students or Black students, who don't want to be teachers. That's what's dominating the discourse. Whereas there are these structural limitations that are preventing students from entering, and that needs to be part of the conversation. Right? I remember interviewing Commissioner Gist several years ago when she was still here. It was for a separate project, but I talked about teachers of color and the whole idea of increasing standards, continuing to increase standards for students to become teachers, because the idea is, in order to improve education in Rhode Island, we need to have the best teachers. And best teachers means the highest testing teachers, right? That's the idea of what good teaching is. It's like, we know that that's not the case. People who do this work know that that's not the case. And yet we continue to get more and more away from what we know will work. Yeah.
Just again, yes, totally spot on. This concept of testing and setting criteria for students to achieve a certain threshold, without the support to get there, the psychological effects on you because you can't get that testing, or because you won't get there, or because you just historically had so many negative experience with that, you know that testing, if that's the criteria, you choose a different path. The test isn't going to reward you. The test isn't going to accept you. You're not going to make that. If that's the criteria, it's a wrap.
Great book. And just echoing the comments here about all these important policy implications. I want to go back to your theory.
Yeah.
And what I see is a very powerful theoretical contribution that I think may have gotten a little bit buried in the presentation. So you talk about policy maintenance and the role of protest in policy maintenance. Two of the leading scholars who come to my mind. So there's Jacob Hacker, and thinking about drift. So policy, it's established and maybe it gets entrenched at one point, but then it just drifts along one of those pathways. But then also Suzanne Mettler and Policyscape, where policies aren't funded, right? So they're on the books, but they're not really funded. And they're just different ways for policies to die different kinds of deaths besides formal retrenchment. And I'm wondering what you see the role of protest is in preventing both of those. Because as I'm thinking about the retrenchment scholarship, I don't see any scholar other than you thinking about protest as the pathway to mitigating against these different kinds of deaths that policies can take.
Yes. So going to the hacker point, right, and to the drift. So I argued that the emergence of these hidden forms of restriction are a form of layering, right? So I do take this on head on in the book. And yes, to my knowledge, to yours as well, we have very little research or any at all that's saying that protest can be an aspect of challenging these different forms of not just retrenchment, but the neutralizing of these types of programs or policies. Yes, I agree entirely, and I think I write about this in the epilogue about protest as policy feedback, right? So what the Talent Development Program does, right? So for those of us in the room who are not political scientists, so there's this idea, this concept of policy feedback, right? And so that once a policy is enacted, it has an effect on how people interpret that policy, and that has an effect on how they engage with government and other aspects of life. So in other words, if a policy is really beneficial and it treats people good, people are more likely to then say government is good, right? So that's simple, right? So there are many policies that affect people of color that have a negative feedback on people of color, right? So that when they encounter this type of policy, they feel that government is not as welcoming, right? So, and because it's not as welcoming, they feel like less trust in government. So that's what we call policy feedback. In a nutshell, it's a lot more complicated than that, but we have a lot of folks in the room who are not political scientists. And so what I argue that the Talent Development Program provides a model for us understanding how protest itself is a policy feedback. And it's necessary to keep these programs going. So Frank Folio, Gerald Williams, who usually, they talk to students, Frank Folio is now retired, but they would talk to students about the importance of fighting and struggling and protest. And so every student that walks into the program has this as part of their understanding of this legacy that they're part of. And so when the program starts to get threatened, they understand that they have to activate to defend the program because it's the legacy of the program. And so I think that there are these, that protest, we need to have more of a conversation, and the scholarship needs to engage more in the conversation about how protest is not just visible in this sense, but I think that if we pay attention to other policy areas, we'll see it as well. It's just not being captured, right? And that to the extent that programs have survived and these policies have survived, there may be these elements of protest that are incorporated into these policies that haven't been captured. And I think for organizers, this is also kind of like a potentially a model for how it is that you can sustain programs over time as well. Yeah. Yes.
I think that concept of drift is really essential because institutions, they do drift and the commitment drifts with it. We were very lucky to make it out of the 70s in talent development. We were very lucky to make it out of the 70s. Domingo, he did a great job of, in general, but especially a great job in talking about what happened in 71 when the students took over the administration building, and really risked their careers and in some ways their lives in that time. When you've got the state police coming in with battering rams, and I mean, it wasn't anything that was nice about it. But after that, you could see that the university wanted to do something to talent development to lessen the impact. And incrementally, over years in the 70s, the institution drifted, well, have you considered this? Does the program need to be 4 years? Could it be 3? Would you fly with me to Kansas and look at a program called camps that would be just a year or 2 to get out from the expense, to, and all of those types of issues. And it was institutional drift that was going on. And those major protests, right, from 71, remember, Domingo went all the way to 1992. There's 21 years in there where this program, talent development, could have actually disappeared, especially in the 70s.
Yeah. And I want to add to this, this part about during the pandemic, the campus was empty, right? The campus didn't have any students. And this was during Black Lives Matters happening. But there were Black people in the University of Rhode Island who still found a way to protest the university. And they were the staff members. The staff members at the University of Rhode Island, most Black staff members, most of them who were talent development graduates, said, while the students are not here and they can't protest, we're going to protest for them. And there's some people who are here and they signed a letter to the university, right, in protest, and we're going to take this day off in protest and things like that, right? So this becomes an important part of this continued legacy of the importance of protest in policy making. No question about it. Yes.
So I think that first of all, what you've done, it brings tears to my eyes. I have to tell you that. It really does. It's truly amazing in terms of what you've produced. And the fact that you've done it with such eloquence and research also speaks volumes to the work that you've done. And I'm sort of speaking from an updated point of view in terms of talent development, and some of what you've said and others have said as it relates to having conversations with departments across campus, right? And the fact that we do have collaboration, campus partners, and actually the colleges that you've just displayed here today, right? The College of Business, College of Engineering, College of Education, and the College of Nursing. And with that said, it also speaks to protests, right? In that while students may not protest there is the program itself, and that wouldn't be me, but that would be all those associated with the program, whether they work for the program or they're partners with the program. They're the ones who will protest as well. It may not be in the protest that we're used to seeing, but they will advocate and protest for some of the things like the GPA requirements to get into those colleges that you're talking about. And with that, there's collaboration that is established where in nursing, we have nursing pathways, right? I don't take credit for that, right? That's something that Sharon and Christina has continued, that Sharon started, right, in terms of nursing pathways. And what that does is it allows students in talent development to have a clear-cut path to nursing. While it may take students who are regular admit 4 years through nursing, it takes talent development nurses 5 years, right? And so we have established that pattern with other colleges, in particular the College of Education, right? We're about to start a pathway for students in the College of Education through talent development with the School of Education, because if you look at the graduates through the College of Education who are getting the degrees, it's mostly white women.
Yeah.
It is mostly white women. And it's almost as if it's a birthright for white women to go through and get their elementary and secondary education. And all you have to do is look and see it. It's not me making this up, right? I watched the School of Education graduation for 2 years. In fact, I watched it for 3 years in a row. They have it streamed at the University of Rhode Island. My interest is because my daughter's in elementary ed, right? And so I have conversations with her about, geez, you know, there has to be something said about why all these white women are getting degrees in education. Something tells me that it's a career that is long lasting, and clearly something that's something that they sustain within their households. And so we've established that, along with the pathways in computer science, obviously is something that everyone needs to at least certainly think about in terms of technology. And so we're thinking about it with the College of Environmental Life Sciences, and that's not how it should be, right? So I just want to make sure that people understand we shouldn't have a pathways to nursing, right? But that's part of our protest to the system that is saying you can't get in to this program regularly.
Yeah.
We just have one more minute, so do you want to say a last word to wrap up?
Last question.
Take one last
Take up
question.
your last question.
I was just wondering, and obviously this probably wasn't part of your research at all, but for the students who weren't able to continue in their majors, where did they go? Did they
It's
become
easy.
Sociology.
What was your degree?
Mine,
Yes.
human development counseling and family
What was your
studies.
degree? Was my degree Human Development and Family Studies. So that's Matthew Buchanan, who I talked about, who's now a principal. His degree was Human Development and Family Studies. And so because they didn't have a minimum threshold, right, and it still somehow met an aspect of a college major that satisfied what we wanted to do, right? So master's degree, yeah. So we'll leave it at that. All right, thank you so much.
I want to thank everybody in the room. There's an unbelievable collection of talent and experience and knowledge. It's not all the time that we can achieve that at Brown, but that's happened right here is just extraordinary to me. So thank you for coming, and please keep on coming and sharing your knowledge and experience with us. And now again, let me thank you, Domingo, for this fantastic.